Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert D. Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Let us talk about coronavirus. Yeah, baby, let's jump on that hype train, you know. And obviously I'm not a doctor, not an infectionist or whatever, so I'm going to focus primarily on the cultural aspects of the state of things right now. So one interesting thing I wish to note, and hopefully this video would be short, but we'll see as usual. So one interesting thing I wish to note about this phenomenon is that I believe that this virus actually represents a unique cultural phenomenon. I'm sorry about that. So, and in particular, what I'm talking about is that most likely, I'm pretty sure about that you watching this video is not infected right now, right? So the chances are really slim. It's like we have about 300,000, I think, cases worldwide. So that puts it to about like 1 in 20,000 probability that you would be infected at this moment at least. And probably none of whom you know are also infected, although I'm not sure about that, but it's most likely the case. So, but you are infected, in fact, in some sense by this virus. And in particular, what I mean by that is that you are concerned by it or with it because it exists in your head, right? So this is the point I'm trying to make, is that this virus is unique in the sense that it spreads first and foremost in informational area, in informational field. So in the virtual reality, fundamentally, in the world of media and internet, first and foremost. So, and there it spreads really quickly. I mean, all the world is affected by it. Literally, I would say all the humans on Earth know about it and are concerned with it or by it. I'm not sure. So it's a unique case in this sense. So it has infected all the world through this virtual reality that we have currently, right? In this sense, it's what Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher, would have called simulacrum. It's something hyper-real because it exists in this world of ideas in some sense, right? So we are infected with the idea of this virus. So the idea of a virus is as actually more infectious, if that's even a word, than the virus itself, probably, right? Because you don't have a virus, yet you are concerned with it, so you're infected with the idea of a virus in some sense. I hope it makes some sense, all right? So, so what really gets infected is people's heads, and that's what causes panic and all these, in my estimation, over-the-top responses to the whole problem, etc. And at the same time, to kind of finish my point, I would say that it underlines the importance of informational hygiene today. So I would state that really informational hygiene has become more important than the physical usual hygiene in today's world, because information is in some sense more important than reality, you know, the meat of things, so to speak, today at least. And so I would recommend, if I may, to keep the informational hygiene up. And in particular, do not spread the panic, do not spread the news about the virus, etc. And you actually probably wouldn't believe how rewarding and like emotionally fulfilling it is, the thing that I do. And in particular, what I do is that if I see some people or some, let's say, groups on Facebook or another social media that try to spread the panic, like let's say I'm subscribed to some astronomical group and it suddenly gets a post about coronavirus, which is like completely unrelated to its, you know, usual scope of topics. So I just immediately unsubscribe from this group. And yeah, it's very rewarding. Like I feel so good after I've done that. Another case of coronavirus in some country. I'm like, yeah, of course, yeah, unsubscribe. It's so emotionally rewarding. You cannot believe that. So I recommend you do something like that. So let those idiots basically sink in their panic and do not spread the infection further. Isolate them, right? Quarantine them in informational realm. That's what I'm saying, essentially. So, yeah, hopefully I've made it clear, so that informational hygiene is really important. And in general, I mean, you, of course, have to expose yourself to other opinions, other political views, let's say religious views or scientific views, etc., just to be aware at least, right? But at the same time, you don't have to be bombarded with it constantly, because it would drive all kinds of negative emotions and things like that. So keep your news feed clean. That's basically what I'm saying. But every now and then, I mean, just to boost up your informational immunity, so to speak, every now and then you have to expose yourself to those malicious agents, so to speak. But okay. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about, although very briefly, is that obviously the spreading of this virus, the whole situation we're in, have led to the appearance of various conspiracy theories, as usually happens. And just as a funny example of one of those, I would mention to you that Israel have been developing a vaccine against coronavirus, although it was the virus that affected poultry, for years now, like for 4 years now, actually, or something to that effect. In particular, in Migal Institute, M-I-G-A-L. Right? So, and they're saying that the vaccine they've developed or are close to developing is actually would help to develop the vaccine against human coronavirus in like literally a few weeks. So that's a pretty interesting thing, especially if you consider the fact that Israel is among the very few countries, like literally 6 or 7 maybe, that has not signed Biological Weapons Convention. So there you go. Okay, so anyway, other thing I wanted to say is that, well, obviously the governments all around the world are trying to regulate the situation, etc. And ultimately they do what they always do. I mean, the governments. I mean, if you've seen my previous videos, you're pretty much aware of my stance on this subject. So what governments do is what they do best, and that's to reduce people's freedoms, basically, and how do you say it? Like delegate more and more power to the governments themselves, and they are happy to use this excuse, this meme, if you like, of coronavirus, which again mostly exists in the virtual world, in the world of media, etc., to boost up their privileges, to boost their power all around the world, basically. And it's a bad situation for everyone. I mean, all the human beings on this planet, except maybe for government officials, and their friends, I mean, the lobbyists, etc., because, well, if they overreact to this situation, I mean, the coronavirus thing is pretty much already an accepted, thing, in the media, at least in this virtual world. So, if the governments would overreact to the problem, it's a win-win situation, basically, because, well, if let's say the virus goes down after that, well, they would say, well, you see, our measures, extreme measures helped, right? But if the virus wouldn't go down because of these extreme government measures, emergency, whatever, they would say, well, you see, we probably should have had even more power and have imposed even stricter regulations, etc. So it's a win-win situation, because anyway, they gain a lot of power from it, right? And actually, what the reality shows is that these regulations, these lockdowns and quarantines, they don't help at all, because, well, the amount of cases still rises exponentially. So it doesn't seem to be the case that any of the measures that the governments take, I underline that the governments take, help in any way. And like as a couple of let's say as a case study, you might compare let's say the situation in Italy versus, let's say, South Korea. So in Italy is a typical, socialistic European country, so you cannot really expect anything from their healthcare. Whereas South Korea is a much more free market oriented economy, and the healthcare is much more private oriented there, etc. So South Korea pretty much contained the virus already. Well, not quite, but pretty much. Whereas Italy is in huge distress because of it. Although, again, if you compare that to, let's say, other cases of deaths, it's still like super unimportant. I mean, the virus. So I'm pretty skeptical about the dangers of the virus in the first place. But anyway, South Korea have contained the virus without any lockdowns, without any extreme measures. So there you go. All right. So that's one problem, that the government regulations would lessen the freedoms of the people quite a lot. And in fact, even when the virus would disappear, because eventually it would, like, it may take a year, it may take like 5 years, but it would disappear. But the problem is that a lot of, let's say, laws, a lot of those extreme measures would remain, and it's a known process. I don't quite remember. There's a name for it, like someone, the last name's Lever or something like that, where an extreme situation causes some sort of response from the government where it increases its own power, but when the extreme situation disappears, the power of the government does not. So it remains. So it's a very known problem, and especially during wars, it's observed. Like during a war, the government like assumes extra powers, but when the war ends, those extra powers remain anyway. So it's a big problem, and we're gonna face it that way or another. Another thing we're kind of already facing is this sort of Greta world, if you know what I mean, where planes don't fly and cars don't drive and people don't work, basically. And so we are already facing a huge economic disruption, again, mostly because of the government regulations. And my claim would be that this economic disruption, we can already see it in stock markets, and we can already see it in just everyday life, etc. This economic disruption would kill, or at least might kill, much more people than the virus itself would, because, well, it would obviously generate poverty and famine, possibly. I mean, like on an individual level, right? So we're gonna face an economic depression just because of these new government regulations and the disruption of usual economic activity all over the world. And that would kill a lot of people, believe me. Like, we're only at the beginning of it, but it's gonna get worse and much worse, and it might, like, we're already pretty much guaranteed to face something like 2008, 2009 economic crisis, like that's already out of the question. Like, we're facing it, but we might face something worse, like the Great Depression, or even worse than that, because, well, the Great Depression was hugely amplified, as well as the crisis of 2008, by the government regulations again, and we're seeing them starting already to, like, as a response to the current economic situation. Like, in particular, we're seeing these new QE, quantitative easing programs from the Fed, etc. So they're gonna flood the economy with money, which is gonna cause malinvestment, which is gonna cause a huge collapse of economy eventually. So this is pretty much inevitable if the governments are gonna continue to do what they're doing, and they're gonna do it because, well, the governments are run by little people and idiots. So what do they know? So yeah. So and this is actually what you really should be afraid of, and not the virus. Like, the virus isn't going to kill you. I mean, even if you contract it, which is unlikely at the moment, the chances that you die, as far as I know, like, the statistics shows it's like 10%. So you have 90% chance of surviving. So, but if you're gonna lose your job because of the government regulations, which you you have quite a high probability of doing so. Well, you're just gonna starve, etc. And that will kill you much quicker than the virus. That's what I'm saying. Like, how long a person can last without food? Like maybe a month? No, I don't think so. Well, maybe a few weeks if you're lucky. Although if you're lucky, you will have food. But anyway, so hopefully you get my point. Like, there is absolutely a potential for new Great Depression thanks to government regulations as a response to this simulacrum of coronavirus. That's what I'm saying, basically. But we're already guaranteed the new 2008-2009 crisis. That's not even questionable at the moment. And okay, another thing I wanted to talk about, at least briefly, is again, culturally speaking, this end of the world kind of mood that many people have today. And I would say that especially in the US, in America, it's like the cultural center of those sentiments, let's say. And it's not surprising to me. And I'm not sure, I think I've talked about this before in some other video, but in case I didn't, I would do it now. So I believe that really this obsession with the end of the world, with all kinds of catastrophes like meteorite falling or the sun exploding or magnetic poles shifting and killing everyone, it's really mostly coming from the United States. And I believe there's a deep cultural reason for that. Like, and in particular, what I'm saying is that I think it's the shallowness, like the thinness of American culture itself that drives these moods. I mean, American culture is at best like 400 years old, and it's an imported culture in the first place, right? So there is, in some sense, no American culture in the first place. I mean, there is a kind of, pop culture that emerged in like 20th century, and the US is obviously the center of that. But there is no tradition, in some sense, of the culture as it is in the US, I mean. And it drives a certain inferiority complex, firstly, which is, by the way, some people speculate, like some thinkers have said, that this inferiority complex, this feeling that the American culture isn't really based on anything solid, that it's so shallow and like a grass, it doesn't have deep roots, etc. It has driven those invasions of Middle East, for example, by the US. Like, the Americans suffered from this inferiority complex, and they wanted to, like, at least get closer to this, like, super ancient culture in the Middle East, at least supposedly super ancient culture. I mean, I'm quite skeptical, as you probably know, about the datings and history in general. But again, supposedly, I mean, those ancient cultural centers of Babylon in Iraq, etc., etc. So yeah. So, like, if you just compare the American culture to European culture, like, Europeans are much more, they're much calmer, I would say. And I believe it's to a large degree, it's caused by this feeling that we Europeans, I mean, we have this, like, at least 1,000-year thick layer of culture underneath of that. So we know we faced a lot of hardships, a lot of troubles, like world wars, even in 20th century, which have devastated Europe completely. But we survived all that, and we still have those centuries of culture even underneath of that, and we still retain all that, etc., etc. Whereas Americans, they're kind of these, pioneers on this frontier, and they feel that they don't have this metropolis behind them, so to speak. They don't have these layers of culture beneath them that would support them and protect them. So Americans are really obsessed with the end of the world because of that, because it's the manifestation of their innate, inherent fear of losing everything, because they don't really have anything, in the first place. So this brings forth those cultural phenomena like preppers, which is almost a purely American thing, who like prepare for the end of the world, so to speak, or these like pop culture phenomena like Fallout universe, this post-nuclear world, etc., which is again based in the US, etc., etc. Okay, so hopefully I've more or less made my point that it is indeed mostly an American thing to be afraid of the end of the world, and right now it's obviously stimulated by the current situation. And I would propose you to also filter that out of your news feed, because, well, Americans aren't really bright in the first place, so why would you impose their cultural traumas on yourself? Okay, so and the last thing I wanted to talk about is more of a, hopefully I didn't forget anything. I really have a feeling I did, but anyway. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is a more of a personal aspect of the whole issue. And in particular, I'm talking about the fear of death. So obviously people think, oh, it's a new virus, we're all gonna die, etc. And they start to bustle, they start to panic and run around. But what I believe is that this running around is really caused by like people were caught by surprise, right, by this whole situation. So it was inherently, this panic is inherently fueled by the inability to accept their own mortality by people. So people who do accept their own mortality, people who memento mori, this Latin phrase, remember about death, people who think about their own death, who accept their own death, they're already not afraid to die anyway. They're living their lives like in full, in some sense, because the more you think about your mortality, the more you focus on important things first and foremost. So you just, sweep out everything unimportant and you just focus on important, and you know that you're gonna die. If that's if that's news for you, then I'm sorry, but you're gonna die anyway. So it's probably healthy to accept that and to think about that and to think about what your priorities in life are, following from that. And like, like a naive view of the thing would say that, oh, if you think that you're gonna die anyway, you're gonna do all kinds of stupid things, but this is not correct. If you think that you're gonna die, if you accept that, if you blah, 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 then you actually start to do important things. You become more disciplined, you become more moral in all kinds of senses. And you become a better person in all respects. And you just remove all this petty bustle again from your life. And again, I believe that this whole panic bustle kind of thing that we're observing today is exactly caused by the inability to accept your own mortality. So people are just, they just are faced with death suddenly with this new whatever virtual meme of coronavirus, and they are caught off guard because they didn't expect that. They did not prepare for their own mortality, right? So they start running around. They try to run away from this in whatever shape or form. And especially, with this social isolation that the governments now recommend, people are left alone to their own themselves, basically, and they don't know what to do because, well, they don't have anything in them, They kept filling their lives with all this external rubbish that they now cannot insert into their lives anymore. So they are really afraid because, well, they're not ready for that, They're not ready to be alone with themselves because they are empty internally, and they are not, they weren't living their lives as they probably should have. But I don't want to sound moralistic, but just on an aesthetic level, right? Just purely in terms of how it looks, I would say that there is no nobility in that sort of behavior, in that running around, being afraid, etc. So it's just aesthetically displeasing to me, at least. It's like this disgraceful cowardice in front of life, first and foremost. So you're not ready to accept neither life nor death in some sense. And I really hope, although I'm quite sure it wouldn't, it's not going to happen, but at least maybe in some cases it would, for which I would be really happy. I hope that at least some people would use this situation to like fix their lives, in the sense that accepting their own mortality, you know, like realizing that running around doesn't really help, realizing that they're gonna die anyway, and start living their lives in a more fulfilled and like steady manner. So this is really my hope. And that all of that segment kind of sounded too moralistic, but I'm inclined to more represent this in aesthetic sense rather than moralistic sense. Like it just looks bad. I mean, if you're running around like an animal, even animals don't really run around, you know. When they know that they're gonna die, they just calmly accept it. So yeah. But you're probably not even going to die. I mean, even if the whole world gets infected by the virus, only like 10% would die. So the probability that you would be among them is not very high. I mean, it's only 10%. So yeah, on this optimistic note, I wish to finish this video. So thank you for watching. The eons are closing.